Laminu would drive men and women across the desert to Libya. At one point, they came across an absolutely nightmarish scene. There was a vehicle that had hit a mine and had been completely obliterated, and the bodies of more than a dozen migrants scattered around the vehicle. My name's Nichole Sobecki. I'm a photographer based in Nairobi, Kenya, where I've been for the last 10 years. I came to Libya a little less than a week after the uprisings had begun. I was essentially sleeping wherever I could find and then spending my days with the rebel forces. This first image is a photo of a protest happening outside of the courthouse in Benghazi. The government had been removed from the city at this point. It was being run by the civilian government. And these protests, they really felt like an opportunity to vent after so many years of silence and to show support for the government in waiting that was being forged behind these walls. This is an image of two rebel fighters outside the Ras Lanuf oil refinery. There's something about this image that always feels very theatrical to me. Like they're almost performing the role of rebel fighter. So you have people in sort of mismatched military garb, but also just this long trench coat, jeans, sneakers. Most of them were not trained fighters. These were engineers, civilians, students, bakers who had come together through their shared goal of defeating Gaddafi. This image was taken from a vehicle that had been hit by an airstrike, killing one man. Rebel forces in this area had rushed to the scene. Volunteers had taken his body away in an ambulance. They were pulling personal artifacts from the car, a bloody shoe, a broken mirror. Men were cursing Gaddafi, praying. Some of them were weeping. It's hard to describe how vulnerable it felt to be out in the desert. There's no cover. There's nowhere to hide. This felt like a very emotional scene where people were expressing their sense of loss for the man who died, but also their sense of vulnerability and fear. Looking through this broken glass, the fractured faces of the men, it's really come to represent the end of that period of optimism and the descent into something much more dark and much more uncertain. This series was shot in Agadez, Niger, which is an old caravan town and really the center of human smuggling on the continent of Africa. It's a 600-mile journey from Agadez to Libya and among the most dangerous journeys in the world. And this is really the gateway to the Sahara. There's one day, it's a Monday, that most of the caravans left through this checkpoint into the desert to begin this incredibly dangerous journey. The men and women who come through here come from all over West Africa and sometimes further afield, the Horn of Africa, other parts of the continent. The migrants gathered all of their belongings, they had prayed, and they had now gotten back into the vehicles and were about to begin their journey. You just had this sense of them going off into the unknown. We're aware of the perils, but it's hard to imagine what it really means to face that. These were actually taken in my hotel room in Agadez. This is Abji. He was 32 at the time that this photograph was taken, and he had been smuggling people across the desert for 15 years at that point. What I was interested in exploring was the sort of complex identities of who these men were. We often kind of pass them off as, okay, smuggler. But really, they're migrants' only chance of getting across the desert safely. Some of them felt very moved by the cause of the migrants. We all know the saying, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. This is a portrait of Laminu. Laminu would drive men and women across the desert to Libya. At one point, they came across an absolutely nightmarish scene. There was a vehicle that had hit a mine and had been completely obliterated, and the bodies of more than a dozen migrants scattered around the vehicle. Laminu was visibly upset while telling us the story. He talked about how You couldn't even identify individuals anymore. It was just body part here, body part there. Despite the risk of being in a minefield, they buried the bodies of the migrants that they found, and they prayed over their grave before moving on. You hear this word smuggler, and I think it's something that we all have preconceptions of in our mind, whether you think it's right or wrong. I think humanizing them felt really important. This is in Somaliland, right on the border with Ethiopia. It's a very mountainous region. I had been in touch with a team of independent investigators that were trying to untangle these relatively unknown networks that were ferrying hundreds of cheetah every year from the Horn of Africa through Somaliland, across the water into Yemen, where they'd be driven to the Gulf and sold as pets. So this was the very first interception that I was able to join them on. We'd spent about a day and a half of a journey just to get here, and we were sitting in this riverbed waiting when the Land Cruiser drove up, and when it stopped, Astor was there in the back seat, and that's when this image was taken. He's 7 months old. The mohawk ridge on the back of his head, and his hair is raised. His sort of orb-like eyes are wide. And one of the rescuers sort of put out his hand, I think in a comforting gesture, but Astor responded by sort of hissing and growling at him, and was clearly, just absolutely traumatized and terrified. So this photo is of 5 cheetah cubs that were brought to a regional courthouse in Hargeisa as evidence in the trial against one of Somaliland's most notorious cheetah traffickers, who goes by the nickname of Abdi Haiwan, which translates to the animal. They were brought in to the judge to see in a case where Abdi Haiwan was charged with trafficking in the stiffest jail sentence that any cheetah trafficker has received in Somaliland before. It's kind of hard to fathom. There are less than 7,000 adult cheetah left in the wild. So this was a major success story. What I hope always is that people respond to my images in a way that evokes some sort of emotion. Photography can bring us into stories and lives and environments far beyond our own personal experience. And I think at best it can help bridge a gap between us and those whose stories could feel very far away otherwise.